So here we are, Lecture 7, the penultimate lecture. I love that word, and I don't often get to use it, so I always do use it when I can. So, turn my phone into silent. What are we up to today? Well, we're thinking about evolution, and I would say that I'm a cultural evolutionist, if there was such a term. Certainly that's what I've been interested in all my life, both at the personal level and at the, I guess, the human cultural level, and even probably from my mid to late 20s on from a cosmic level as well. I'm surrounded by material that one way or another feeds into that cultural evolutionary framework. My challenge in this lecture, because it's in many respects it's quite a personal lecture, is to not inundate you with my own writing, because that gets boring. And you know, last week we were talking about a tribe. Well, my tribe is all over the place. It's all in these books. It's in the music I play. The tribe is everywhere. And that means that I look around and I say, well, who can help me with this particular lecture? And of course, the first level is intuitional. What happens, you know, what's my intuitional mind picking up that I want to bring down and present to you? That means go and get a coffee, have a sleep, have a sip, have a walk in the garden or around the place, make some bread, which I did yesterday, and so on. Means open up, slow down, because if you're not going at a kind of slow pace, you can't actually get into the right space to talk about this kind of stuff. Not that it's deeply esoteric, but it's certainly kind of, there's a mystery to it. There is something there, as one of my guests in my tribe say in this particular lecture, there's stuff we don't know. We will never know what's happening until it's already happened. And sometimes we need distance. And what is distance? Well, distance can be distance from afar. Thank God we're here and America is over there. But it can also be temporal distance. Gandhi was once asked, what do you think the effects of the French Revolution have been? And he said, it's too early to tell. And that was, you know, nearly 200 years after the French Revolution. So, you know, that kind of insight, foresight, wisdom, whatever we want to call it, we can draw on. So I breathe out and we start to focus in. There is this beautiful earth of ours. What are we looking at? Well, we're looking at evolutionary futures. My key lens is what I call anticipatory aesthetics, which I've been working on since, well, first paper came out I think in 2017, but certainly long before that with a whole bunch of other articles. And, you know, I'm interested in not natural selection in the evolutionary term, but what I call cultural selection. Cultural selection is an evolutionary mechanism that is reasonably, I'd have to say, uniquely human, because it allows for all those interesting algorithms that underpin culture to create new forms. It's constantly experimenting. Life is never still. Life is relentlessly active. Doesn't matter whether you're going slow or fast. Slow for me might be incredibly fast for a caterpillar. Fast for me might be incredibly slow for a hummingbird. What do we make of positrons, neutrons, and all those other things, and those incredible new elements to the periodic table that last for a millionth and a millionth of a second and that sort of stuff? Speed is a very relative thing. So we're panning in here now. Distance. Okay, what do I want to say? Well, let's start playing with this idea of evolution and where is it taking us. So I want to say that we evolve physically. That's the genetics. We evolve socially. We evolve social systems to solve problems. The problem with social systems is that they tend to get stuck, and we have to put up with them for thousands of years. Systems like hierarchy, patriarchy, religion, and so on. We also evolve culturally. That's a slower speed. So we evolve social systems. We've got AI as a problem today. What's the problem with AI? It's hard to say yet, other than it creates, deep identity and security, creates excitement enough for others. But we're developing new laws and technologies to manage AI. So we've got AI, it comes along, we have to develop social systems, legal systems, and so on. Evolving culturally is a different matter altogether. What will AI bring to the cultural table? Well, it's too soon to say. There is a certain kind of creativity involved in AI, but it's a kind of creativity that is rather, from my perspective, because I come from a fine arts family with paintings and printmaking and all that sort of stuff, it's also rather predictable. It has an aesthetic quality to it that pleases, it can order, it can do all those things. But for me, so far, I have not seen a lot of AI that has sparked that deep wonder and awe that you get when you see something that's been created in the more traditional sense. But of course, that could just be my age. We're going to talk about age and the way different generations see things in this lecture too. But we also evolve personally. I started out as a little boy in the 1960s, growing up in a rather Christian family. And we started discovering the big wide world at the end of the 60s and into the 70s. I got introduced at that time to yoga. It was 1972 I started doing asanas. That was fun. Reading all sorts of interesting stuff, reading not just within the Christian world, but of Greek myths, and then also into non-Western stuff, reading Jung. These are things that were feeding into me. Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, all that kind of stuff. All this was coming into me, and then in the 80s, I started really getting into education. I was already playing the guitar by then too, so music was there. So my whole biography, just like yours, each of our biographies is telling a story. And that story is of how do we get to where we are now. But of course, it's not a finished story. It's an unfinished story, just like the overall question of this evolution. What is it all about? Where are we going? So Lisbeth Sahtouris, a fabulous woman, physicist, she says, look, if the universe evolves within a field of consciousness, as I, among increasingly many other scientists, have come to believe, then the most likely single operating principle of such a self-organizing living universe is anything that can happen will happen. In such a wide open creative universe, it's not interested in rights and wrongs, the morals and ethics that we might have as mere mortals. It's interested in seeing what happens if this happens. What is of greatest interest to me is what is sustainable. So she's laying her cards on the table. Okay? What is sustainable is what interests her. What lasts, especially under disruptive conditions. So that was in 2010. The reference for this is underneath the slide. Okay, so that's where we get to, thinking of evolution as a process, an ongoing, never-ending process of cosmic experimentation. I like to use the word play. Wow, what happens if this and that happens? How big can we get dinosaurs to get before they start, dying out? That sort of thing. So this led me quite some time ago to come up with this concept of cosmopoiesis. There's some articles about it. I'm going to be drawing on my chapter on cosmopoiesis from my new book, The New Humans, Yearning and Becoming book. So we evolve with others, very much like what David Graeber said in the second slide to the previous lecture, okay? The human and the non-human, though, so I'm bringing in the non-human, whereas Graeber was more focused, his comment was more focused on the human-human co-creative plane. Whereas I'm introducing the non-human. Not that David Graeber wouldn't have thoroughly welcomed the non-human, it was just that the context that I took that quote from was a very human context. Okay, so there we are. We're evolving with others, and that's cosmopoiesis. And the cosmos is evolving with us too. It is just the largest frame of reference. So what do I say about this? The world is becoming strange to itself, all right? This strangeness is the result of two interrelated states. The first is a surprise of becoming increasingly self-aware of our human embeddedness in the evolutionary unfolding of the cosmos. We've discovered ourselves in the universe. That is a big surprise. The second arises from the terror that this new consciousness evokes in us. In the Hebrew story of Adam and Eve and their awakening, they are surprised to find themselves naked. That story points to a similar surprise and terror. So I'm situating the story mythically in Adam and Eve, but I'm saying, look, really, you can see that the world is becoming strange. Who would, 50 years ago, or even 25 years ago, have imagined that we would have a world where Trump, Putin, Xi, Netanyahu are all very complacently and happily wreaking havoc with the world order and with the kind of morality or ethics or whatever you want to call it that has held the world together since pretty much 1945 with the downfall of totalitarianism in totalitarian Germany and the Nazi regime. Things are very, very different and they're moving at lightning speed. So what can we say? Well, I want to approach this from three ways. As I said, I don't want to use my own voice throughout this lecture. So I'm going to get people to say what I want to say, which of course is what academics do, right? So 3 lines of flight. One is I'm taking a chapter from The Power of Yin, which is a glorious book. But before that, I'm going to draw on Timothy Morton and his short essay, All Art is Ecological, and it's a great place to start. It's the sort of book that I think most of you might end up rushing off to buy after this. Is small, and Morton writes very thoughtfully, but it's not inaccessible, as you will discover. Then I turn to Frank Spencer, who's a wonderful futurist from the United States, and he will appear with his life partner Yvette in a upcoming interview. He's just written a really great piece called Hospicing Modernity, where he's basically riffing off Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, who's a Brazilian-Canadian eco-philosopher, who's talking about, it's hospicing modernity I've written there. That's wrong. It's hospicing futurity. I'll have to change that slide before I put it up on for you. So his little article is called Hospicing Futurity. He's saying not only do we have to hospice the present, the very moment we're in, this modernist world, and help it die, we also need to foster futurity itself, the concept of the future as a space of open potentiality rather than grim fear. And then we'll come to the chapter by Hazel Henderson, Jean Houston, and Barbara Marx Hubbard from 1977. And that's a really interesting story, and I'll tell you a bit more about that when we get there. So let's keep moving then. Sorry. So here we are with Timothy Morton. Tim Morton has been writing really challenging, thoughtful, exciting books for about the last 10 to 15 years now. I've got at least 3 of them: Humankind, the Dark Ecology, and another one, not counting the arts one, Hyperobjects. That's it. So I've got 4 of his books. So they're well worth getting because he gives us a creative language for handling things. And you'll get that sense right now. Let me read this to you. So he's talking about how do we be ecological? What does it mean? There is an uncanny gap between the little me and me as a member of what is called a species. We are all Homo sapiens sapien, right? That's what he's saying. But hang on a second. I'm also me sitting here right now giving this little talk to you. The human species caused global warming, not the octopus species. So let's be clear about that. It's not the octopus's fault that we have global warming. It's something that we as a collectivity, as a species, are doing. But species is exactly what we can't point to. We can't point to it. Oh, there's the species. There's the species. It's always an individual, a single member of a species. So I find that I am and I am not a human insofar as I did and did not contribute to global warming. Humanity caused global warming. Me, Marcus Bussey, sitting here right now, and you guys all out there as individuals, you didn't cause global warming, depending on what scale you think on. So these scales, that's between me and a species, don't have a smooth transition point between being one human and being part of a total population of humans. Suddenly we find ourselves on one scale or another, and it really depends. It's very subjective. Where do we sit? What level of responsibility do I take for global warming? Well, being a boomer, I have to take more responsibility than you Gen Xers, and then moving down the line to the millennials and so on. So there is a level of responsibility that my lifestyle, my choices that I've inherited and been born into are contributing to this, what he would call a hyper-object, a meta-problem, which is global warming. The species, as a meta level of human beings, is responsible. The species' choices, its relationship particularly with energy flows, its cultural positioning in terms of validating, reifying growth, consumption, hyper-individuality. These are elements that have underpinned the world into which we have all been born. Where does he go with that? Well, let's have a look. So he says this, well, Morton, this is me, sorry, not him yet. Well, Morton is arguing with his usual style that ecological thinking is gripped by current agricultural thinking. He refers to that often, that, we are the descendants of, 10,000 years of agricultural civilization. Okay? He's saying this, it is binary and messy and folded and disorienting because what we take for real is culturally constructed. We have to remember that there is no real without the cultural filters that we all have. And that's why, we argue amongst ourselves all the time, because my filters and your filters might be very different. Let's continue and see what he says. I love this bit. We're always entangled in the thicket of prefabricated concepts that might not apply so well because of the slippery quality of being. The prefabricated concepts are those concepts we've inherited in our own culture, right? So because of the slippery quality of being, everything moving around, what might work, in somebody's house, let's say I can turn on the electricity, I can power my computer and I can do a Zoom session with you right now recording this. Oh, I'm doing that, and that gives me a lot of independence, right? Yes, but at a global level, the power that is being used to generate this communication form and sustain it is, distorting the whole global energy ecosystem. So then he goes on. Take a breath. Things are exactly what they are, yet never how they appear. Well, there's a paradox for you. Yet appearance is inseparable from being, so that a thing is a twisted loop like a Mobius strip. So this concept then of this agricultural thinking, what's he really asking? He's asking this question. Have we ever really been modern? Basically, we're still Neolithic people living as though, tomorrow might not be there, living with a sense of insecurity. He's asking the question that Bruno Latour asks in one of his great books, have we ever been modern? No, we've never been modern. He doesn't ask it as a question, he makes it as a statement. So Bruno Latour is worth looking at. But Morton then points to the following. Conventional wisdom says that being ecological is a special and different kind of being, akin to becoming a monk or a nun. It's a disciplinary world, in other words, that disciplinary scenario that Jim Data gives us, okay? And the theory of action that fuels this special being also has a religious patina to it. That's why I put the three little monkey types there. Monks, not monkeys, sorry. All right. So conventional wisdom is that ecological thinking is special. In other words, somehow we have to become ascetics. In other words, we have to turn our back on coffee and Netflix and everything else and say, no, none of that. It's all bad for us. It's all sinful and all of that sort of stuff. So he's still seeing that the way we're even framing the ecological is within a very, or you would have to say pre-modern way, that there's still this religious zeal, this sense of judgment and morality that goes with it, that is not constructive. It's actually a very negative image, and of course most people will never want to go there, and they would prefer to, for the world as we know it, to go up with a puff of smoke rather than become, monks and nuns living some kind of constrained existence. And here my historical brain goes to the once the revolution in England was over, the English Revolution, which sort of came to an end with the execution of Charles, the King. He with his demise, we had Oliver Cromwell and a bunch of Puritans take over. What was the first thing they did? Well, they banned Christmas, they banned parties, they banned the theatre, which was the equal of banning Netflix or the movies. They banned all these things. It didn't last more than about 15 years. People were absolutely over that ascetic kind of diminished existence. So where do we go from here? Well, Morton has one more thing to tell us. When it gets to hand-wringing, ecological talk retains a strong smell of the agricultural age machinating that got us into this mess. Oh no, the world is coming to an end. It's all our fault. Okay? We've been bad and we deserve to be punished. I don't want to live in a world that kind of machinating would bring about, he says. Instead, I think of a world, and here he's turning to the positive, the optimist, a world in which we can see so much more be so much more generous and creative than we've ever been. So much less caring in that kind of judgmental sort of maternal, paternalistic way, in that way that is hostile to actual life forms. Survival mode. We don't want survival mode, we want thrival mode. We want a mode in which everybody can realize their human potential within whatever the boundaries are that they're in. We want a world that is marked by what he would call distributive justice. The problem is that 1 or 0.1% of the planet holds most of the cash and has most of the freedom to do what they want. And we know what that means. All right, so that's Morton. And he takes us a long way towards a good understanding, a diagnostic, you might say, but also prognostic. In other words, he's looking towards what he would like. What he would like is a world that is generous and creative. All right? So, now, Frank Spencer and his lovely article online. So the article online is found at the little blue reference there. It's not in print, okay? So he has a couple of things to say. The thicket, the muddle, the movement, the wanderings. You can hear he's sounding like Tim Morton already. These are the diverse, interconnected and emergent places that produce the transformative realities that define life. Clarity is overrated. Control is overrated. We have to flow through the thicket. We have to move through the muddle. We have to trust the wanderings and the meanderings that are part of life. We do not work things out as such. We discover what works best at a moment in time. Then we have to be prepared to let them go, because that's the problem, is that we can't let things go. We hang on to things that are no longer useful. I don't know, monarchy, colonialism, capitalism. Capitalism took us to a certain point and gave us the energy to sort of break free of the gravity of, energy ceilings and so on. An energy ceiling is an energy regime, you would say, that held people in place, that nobody had electricity. So we didn't have microwaves or anything, and suddenly we've got things that, any, pharaoh or emperor from the past would not even be able to dream of, and we've suddenly got them all. So there's an amazing thing there, and I think we need to be astonished by that. That's another kind of surprise, isn't it? But, we need to be able to let go. So what is Frank saying here? Well, he takes us to this point. This is his hospicing futurity that I got mixed up in that previous slide. I'm going to have to go and correct it, right? So he says, look, in the end, this is almost his final statement, in the end, truly impactful foresight and futures thinking requires the willingness to facilitate the death and burial of that dominant narrative. That's what I mean by letting go. An embrace of cooperative connection for evolutionary transformation. a perception of emerging realities over in realities over in systems trends. So a perception of the emerging realities over in system trends. Okay, so we've got to not be caught up by the trends. A universal and symbiotic view of large-scale processes over object orientation. We need that oil well. Okay, that's a nation state. A co-creative, not cooperative, a co-creative embrace of transformation over the future-proofing of our static world, and a deep change of our hearts, minds, and souls. If Andreotti, who's the woman who coined hospital, I'll just keep reading, if Andreotti is right in saying that we need to hospice modernity, then we will certainly need to hospice futurity, to end the corruption of the dominant system and allow for the birth of emergent systems of transformation, and a futures thinking and foresight practice that no longer services the machine of a colonial world. I think that's really, really interesting. To hospice is to basically provide palliative care for end of life. We need to hospice the modern world we're in. That's Andreotti's argument. We need to hospice futurity, which means the sense of the future that in so many ways is bound by that list that Frank gave us at the top there. We just reading that big. Yeah, the realities, emerging realities, okay, over in-systems trends. We don't want to, manage in-system trends. We want to be, of course, use them to describe potentialities. We want to get away from object orientation. We want to bypass future-proofing, which is a noxious term. I've never liked that term. So these are the sorts of things that Frank is critiquing in this paper. It's a really good one, and he provides you with a number of really interesting people to go and have a read of as well. Moving on then, now, going back nearly 50 years. So I have this beautiful book, The Power of Yin, Celebrating Female Consciousness. It's the chronicle of a number of conversations held between Hazel Henderson, an economic energy activist who died, about 10 years ago now, Jean Houston, still alive but in her late 80s, and Barbara Marx Hubbard, who also died, 2019 or something. But, these were women who were really at the cutting edge of, you would have to say, creative cultural thinking and activism in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, into the 2000s even. So this book is a record of conversations they had in 1977 and 1978. And, that it's a beautiful co-creation and coming together. I'm drawing on the first of the conversations in which Barbara Marx Hubbard turned to Jean Houston and said, give us an overall picture of where you think we're at today. So this is very much, drawn from Jean Houston's own words. So it's kind of like a monologue from her. But I don't want to, you've got to be monologuing with the right kind of people. So you've got a dialogue, really. And that dialogue is, we're hearing what Jean Houston is seeing back then in 1977. So she asked this, how do you find a paradigm for an emergent? Emergent what, you might say? Well, that's the whole point. What is emergent? How do we find a paradigm for that? This is the problem with so much of our work, because she and Henderson and Hubbard are all working at the growing edge where we don't know what the future holds. The expectation of the people they are working to kind of redirect those energies are that tomorrow is going to be the same as today. We're going to be driving, petrol fuel cars and so on. This is 1977, right? They've just been through or going through, a fuel crisis that doesn't pales into insignificance compared to us now, but it was a big deal back in the 70s. So she's saying, look, how do we do this? So their work, her work, is consciousness raising, essentially, making us aware of the relational nets that we're part of. She goes on to say, we are not the only ones mining the store, however. The universe is immensely thick. I really like that. We are compared to the reality out there like a bug. So the human species, let alone the human individual, we are insignificant in the universe at the cosmic level. But she's saying, look, she trusts to the fact that there is some kind of consciousness principle shaping and managing the story, she says. The story is not just one-sided. It's not just human beings writing a story, and this is an interesting thing. So she then goes on, why the hell are we so over-endowed with brain capacity? She actually maps it all out, how many neurons we've got and all that sort of stuff. We do not need this stuff. We're not using it. I believe we are so over-endowed because we have the capacity to make quantum leaps to new forms and structures of being. The world is thickening. We are coming to a flowering of global civilization. 1977. We are, but before we get there, and of course time is irrelevant because the flowering of any civilization takes sometimes thousands of years to achieve. But we are on the cusp. We are definitely feeling all the birth pangs of something new. And the horror of the birth pangs is, of course, that people will try and keep the baby in. They don't want the baby let out. They don't want a new form of consciousness. They don't want new social structures because, of course, they are deeply invested in what they perceive to be what is. Okay, so she then moves on. So she's giving us a diagnostic. Okay, where do we go? All right, we're entering, she says, into universal life. We probably came from the depths, though, and the depths are rising to nurture and sustain us. Here she's being Jungian, you could say, the depths. What is happening, we do not know. And I really appreciate that because back in 1977, most people said that they knew things. It was the dominant paradigm. But she's saying, no, we don't know. We don't know what's going on. But what is clear to her and to Hazel Henderson and Barbara Marx Hubbard is that they have a part to play in all of this. So we are being born. That's a very active thing, isn't it? Into the universe. We have a birth to announce. Here it is. It is our own. We, our whole planetary body, so it's not just the human body, it's the planetary body, was struggling to coordinate. Pain was coursing through the whole system. The birth pangs. We are running out of energy, gasping for breath, reaching into space towards the sun. Just, a decade before we landed people on the moon, right? And that sort of stuff. With the reach outward, I felt, this is Jean Houghton herself, a profound interlinking of all the other cells on the body of this planet. I call it synergizing Earth. So the synergizing Earth is the becoming aware of a collective identity. And we become aware of it, we perceive it, but we don't know what it means. That's why the not knowing is so important. So she concludes, a lot of acts choose one. Okay, we get chosen. When you enter into a realm of organism environment and you do what you have to do in your regular life, be it remaking a house, doing an experiment, giving a talk, then you are in such a state of resonance with the essential realities that are emerging and begin to choose you. So in other words, when you're in alignment, the acts choose us. If I'm doing something, I'm giving this talk now, right now, and I'm touching you, I'm touching your minds, maybe touching your hearts too. Because these are beautiful ideas, these are profound ideas, these are slow ideas, you need to think about them. I've been thinking about them for a long time and I'm not going to stop thinking about them, just having finalized everything with a lecture, for instance. No. It's just an ongoing thing. So at one level, I'm giving this talk and these realities might be choosing me, but maybe they chose me long ago. And of course, I'm also talking to myself every time I go through this stuff. So she continues, we don't know who is the chooser and who is the chosen. This is a very Timothy Morton thing picked up years later by him. Are you the dancer or are you being danced? And it doesn't make any difference. You don't lose your will just becomes much, much larger. So that's the way she ended her kind of soliloquy monologue at the beginning of this book. And it's a book of beautiful discussions, as I said, highly recommended to you. It's not very expensive. It's easy to go and find on Amazon or somewhere. So I want to jump now. So that were my three lovely kookaburra out there having a giggle. They were the three people I decided I would use to sort of segue into what I really want to talk about. First of all, a little bit more on consciousness. Here we go. So consciousness, identity, and time. I've already owned up to the fact that, oh no, I'm a boomer. Some of you are Gen Xers, some are millennials. There might even be a few Gen Zers amongst us, okay? Each generation has a different experience of the world. They are cumulative because having done the 200-year present, you can say, okay, a millennial here, well, their 200-year present, if you were born in 1980, well, it goes back to 1880 and it goes forward into 2080, roughly speaking, let's say. So wherever we sit here, we have a layered cake of consciousnesses, plural. And those consciousnesses are always interacting. We are cross-fertilizing. My boomerness becomes the compost for Gen Xers, and Gen Xers and myness become compost for millennials, and so on. Soon all of us will be compost anyway, okay? So the question, of course, that this little diagram gives you is, well, how do generations shape the global population of 2035? Okay, in 2035, you know, the number of the global population will consist of 16% of Gen Betas, okay, who are people born this year and over the following 15 to 20 years or so. So you can see that in actual fact, there is a decline in global population of new generation thinking. That's going to have an impact. Where is that thinking going to occur? It's going to occur in countries where the most population is, because numbers also meaning access to high levels of creativity. Just the question I want to pose, because the evolutionary dimension of this is, again, currently, as Gene Houston would have said, beyond us. So I want to give you now, here's my map at one level. There are a number of ways that I'll do this mapping, but this is me being a macro historian, you might say. I use a macro historical lens. I look at human beings embedded in nature, which I think of as collective one. I've got a diagram coming up for this, which will make it possibly more obvious to you. But, you know, human beings embedded in nature, that's, you know, the Paleolithic humans, and also the earlier hominids who came before us, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo neanderthalis, and so on. So the human species as we have it today, this kind of singular Homo sapiens, didn't come from nowhere. We evolved over quite a number of millions of years, and all of that time we were part of the natural world. We were also part of the food chain. We were prey more than we were predators, okay? And then we come to what I think was collective too, which is the early agricultural period, where still we acted as collectivities, and we farmed, we nurtured the soil, and so on. And then we have this interesting shift, okay, where individuals start to matter and arise. And so that particularly is happening from, you know, let's say the Christian period on, the period in Europe where individuality became even more marked from the Renaissance, for instance. And we began harnessing technology and dominating nature in ways that it went beyond what we were able to do beforehand. This ultimately led to an industrialized period where we absolutely ravaged the world. We created, as Timothy Morton points out, climate change as a species. And then what's happening? Well, we're now re-engaging with nature. The relational dimension is being forced on us, okay? So the way they map that is to say, okay, we had the Paleolithic, Neolithic, that's collective one. We had the agricultural civilizations, everything from Mesopotamia through to China and the Inca and the Maya. Then we have industrial civilizations from the last 2 to 3 centuries particularly. And now, possibly, relational civilizations. None of these things should not be seen as too linear. There were always, aberrations along the way. There were always faults. And I use it to map it with this diagram. Okay, so here we're in the cosmos, we are indigenous, we have agricultural consciousness here, and our ability or our awareness of our relational links to the world around us, to the non-human or more than human, declines and declines, reaching its lowest point in our world now, the industrial world, and we're starting to emerge into what might be considered a new civilizational model, the relational. That's what Morton and Frank Spencer and Henderson and Houston and Barbara Marx Hubbard are all yearning for. And that's what I yearn for. And yearning is important. I'm going to tell you why in a moment. So you can have a look at that, think about it. Essentially, I want you to look at this arc. As we develop more complex worlds, we get more and more disconnected from nature, more and more disconnected from the world out there, because we need to manage and govern that world. That world's dangerous. Floods, droughts, tigers, and so on. So we have a fear of that world. And the only way to manage it is to control it or to eradicate it, suppress it, dominate it. Sigh. Okay, so what's happening then? Well, let's move on to this point. There is an anticipatory aesthetics at work here, and I've got a number of points that I want to point out. I've been developing my approach to the evolutionary nature of humanity and planet over some decades now. It grows out of my time. So here's my biography in a sense as a teacher. It is informed by my own spiritual practice, meditation and yoga. It is informed by my lifelong curiosity for creative play and story. It is informed by my love of nature and the natural world's mysteries. And it is also informed by my historical consciousness and the cultural flows that I have explored. All of these things are assets. At some level, I could say, well, they also provide me with data, the data that I need to tell stories about human potentiality. Think about your own assets. Think about your own data set. Where might that take you? So, what can I say about aesthetics? Because I'm calling this anticipatory aesthetics. The word aesthetics is linked to the arts, right? But I see it as an integral element of art, of the art of living. Okay? There is an aesthetics to living, just as there is an aesthetics to a painting and so on, but they shouldn't be confused because they are related, but not the same. We might see the aesthetics of the art of living in a Japanese tea ceremony or an indigenous corroboree, Australian indigenous, where there is a kind of patterning and a process and a beauty and a symmetry of culture and intent. But there's also an aesthetics for the person who orders in a pizza and sits down and watches TV or Netflix or something, or plays online games while munching on their pizza. It's just what one might say less sophisticated than a Japanese tea ceremony, but it's still an aesthetics. It's an ordering, okay? So aesthetics is a sense-making tool. It orders the world around us in certain ways. It is what you might call a cultural filter, a very important, powerful cultural filter, okay? When it comes to the future, we are not blind, but we are definitely encultured. We need to be aware that our own aesthetics, our own sense of order, what makes sense and what doesn't make sense, really is filtering much of what is intelligible to us. So then, well, what do? We suffer from what David Graeber has called dead zones of the imagination. That's our hero David Graeber again. Dead zones of the imagination. Usually bureaucracy, repetition, dull repetition with not much meaning to the actions anymore other than that they pay the bills or whatever. Yet we have the innate capacity to rewire cultural codes and social norms. That's where the hacker comes in, okay? So let me turn now to the future senses. So the future senses themselves are the tools that I think are available to us all. Just as we have physical senses for navigating the world out there. Oh, I heard that. Oh, I saw that. I can smell a fire. That's dangerous. Better move away. Those sorts of things. So we have these physical senses that help us navigate the world out there. We also have future senses that help us navigate the world in our heads, the individual and the collective both. Memory is a memory passed as a data set, okay? That data set is everything that lies within our memory and also beyond it, because culture is a form of collective memory. Foresight, derived from the images from the past, so culture. So we have foresight, and as we start thinking futures-wise, we are looking at optimal preferred futures. We are looking for the things we want to avoid, like, absolute complete social collapse and so on. And we are strategizing. We have skin in the game. You and I are alive. We may have children or grandchildren. We have friends. We also love the world around us, the natural world. We have skin in the game. We're trying to foresee things, anticipate them, but also activate our evolutionary or co-evolutionary role in this world. Whether we're an individual or a species, as Timothy Morton says, it doesn't matter when it comes to the evolutionary dimension of human being. We all have a role to play. And that role leads us to voice. What's our voice? What is it that you and I bring to the table? Our ability to choose and act within given constraints. So we are in a part of the world, Australia, most of us, or Europe. We have gender. We are male or female. We may be het or bi or whatever. That's another constraint. We have certain financial capacities. Some of us might have a bit more money in the bank than others, probably to do with how old we are, and how much we've worked over our life. These are certain aspects, but voice really comes down to, well, what do we do with the space given to us? What do we do? How do we activate our capacity to be co-evolutionary players in futures that we would desire? The more we actually dig into voice, the more optimistic we become. Our sensing of possibility engenders optimism. So this is really important to understand, that there's actually a link, that as we activate our voice, we are shaping our foresight, drawing on memory. We are, what I say in one of my poems, cherry picking the past for what's best in us, okay? That feeds our optimism. And what's driving it all? Well, I'm calling it yearning, have been for a long time, the calling into life that keeps all things in motion in the universe. So this yearning is really, really, it's the driving engine of evolution. You can see that multi-celled organisms arose out of single-celled organisms. There was a kind of ordering in the yearning of the single-celled organisms that led them to create larger, over billions of years, millions of years, forms and so on. I think that's really, really interesting. It's very Lamarckian, who was a slightly early predecessor of Darwin, who saw that yearning or desire actually had a role to play in evolutionary processes. It's not everything, but from my point of view, as a cultural person, culture yearns to sustain, to enlarge, to grow, expand. Culture has its own yearning mechanisms. The Egyptians started building small pyramids. They ended up building big ones, and then they went bankrupt. So they started building, incredible temples instead. But and then the Roman Empire started off as a muddy city on the banks of the Tiber, and ended up this massive global civilization, of which we are all inheritors today, the good and the bad of it. Yearning. Just think about that. So, last few slides coming up now. And here I am unabashedly quoting myself. Co-evolution of folded futures. If the purpose of the universe, I say, is to generate a reflexive consciousness to better know itself, the journey I have sketched here, in this lecture you could say, is one possible way of understanding what is happening in our world today. To make sense of the struggles we face when confronted by the strangeness and pain, resistance encountered when being forced by pressure of circumstance to become increasingly aware and responsive to relational being. The pushback, massive pushback from the Putins and Trumps and co of this world is because this process is becoming excruciatingly painful for people who do not want to change. So in a sense, we are being invited to return home as dusty pilgrims on the road to our mother's lap after having experienced the world as a rich and extraordinary place where form and spirit are playing together. So that's me giving a kind of narrative structure to this concept of the co-evolutionary nature of being in the world. And then I offer the lovely, rich, juicy metaphor of future's pheromones, okay? The past holds memory both at the cellular, that's the genetic, and cultural levels of being. We are wired for culture and we weave into it our dreams and our fears. Always a choice here, to love or fear, to hope or despair. As a data set of all that has been, the past, that whole messy, squirming lump of it, is a challenge to take from into our best, whilst recognizing the violences and missed opportunities that reside there. This recognition is so important. It frames our present but does not define it. The past does not define us. We are always in potential more than any given moment. Just think of the Gene Houston's comments. We are always in potential more than any given moment because we are spiritual beings. Love is not about possession or control. It is about surrender. A few pages later, life is creative, ever playful and exploring possibility. This creativity is within us all. It is a deep form of and source of love. Love is creative. It is life. It is busy, as this song that I quoted earlier suggests, creating more life. And the future is where we find it always calling us, always inventing new forms and reconfiguring the old. It is the pheromone, and I love that image of possibility, the pheromone of possibility. Can you smell it, everyone? Sniff. And I love that language and culture with its myth and metaphor provide us with the possibility to play with the sounds of this future's pheromone. So the future calls to us. It's not something we should be fearful of. It's something that we can draw on in curiosity, with love, aiming for the best in what is possible within our context. Knowing that the best, there is no ceiling, there is no limit to what we are capable of other than the limits we choose ourselves. So, moving to the last slide now, I want to suggest that we need a new story, right? And I'm sick of my own voice, so, a new story, if you have a listen to this, it's, 12 minutes? A short story written by futurist Claire Marshall. She's somebody that, I've worked with for quite a few years now, on and off. And I'm tracking her down to see if we can have a chat at some point. She's a wonderfully energetic futurist. And she has skin in the game. As she said, she has 2 kids and so on. Here she's telling a story of how did we get to the year 2035. Okay, so have a listen, enjoy. Think about evolutionary processes. Think about how do you see your role in the unfolding futures of our species and of yourself. It's a big, big question, but it doesn't need to overwhelm you. As I said at the beginning of the lecture, slow down, breathe, listen, feel. It's all okay. Whatever happens, it's all okay. So, having got that far, I just want to thank you and say, have a good week. I'll talk to you later. Okay, I'm kind of at loss for words. Fancy that. See you then. Bye-bye.